The letter from the residential tenancies branch was sitting on my kitchen counter between an empty coffee mug and a stack of unopened bills, and I remember thinking it looked so ordinary for something that was about to tear my entire life apart. 10 days. That was the number printed in clean black ink beneath the Manitoba government letterhead. 10 days to either pay what I owed or vacate the apartment I had called home for the past 4 years on Ellis Avenue in Winnipeg. Outside, the first real snowfall of November was piling up against the window in thick, quiet layers, and the radiator in the corner was clicking, the way it always did when the temperature dropped below -15, like it was trying to remind me that winter in this city does not wait for anyone to get their life together. I pulled the letter closer and read it again. The total amount owed was $4,200, 3 months of back rent at $400 each. I had $87.43 in my checking account. I checked. I had been checking every morning for weeks, as if the number might somehow change overnight, as if some forgotten direct deposit might appear like a miracle between the grocery charges and the monthly phone bill I could barely afford. My name is Ethan Carrière, and 6 months before that letter showed up, I had been working as a line cook at a restaurant called Blackwoods on Corridon Avenue. It was one of those places that had been around long enough that people just assumed it would always be there. Wood-paneled walls covered in old hockey jerseys and concert posters. A menu that hadn't changed much since the early 2000s. The kind of restaurant where regulars came in every Friday night, and the servers already knew their orders before they sat down. I had worked there for almost 5 years, starting as a dishwasher when I was 23 and slowly working my way up to the hot line. It wasn't fancy work. I wasn't plating tasting menus or dreaming about Michelin stars, but I was good at it. I knew how to keep a Friday night service running when the tickets were backed up to the printer and the fryer was screaming. And someone had just burned a whole batch of perogies. I knew the rhythm of that kitchen the way you know the layout of your own apartment in the dark. Then one Tuesday morning in May, I showed up for my shift and found a handwritten note taped to the back door. The owner, a guy named Paul, who had inherited the place from his father, had decided to close. Just like that. No warnings, no staff meeting, no 2 weeks' notice. The note said something about mounting costs and declining revenue, and he was sorry. I stood in the alley behind the restaurant, reading that note with my chef's jacket slung over one arm, and I remember the specific absurd detail that kept running through my mind. I had left my favorite paring knife in the drawer beside the prep station, and now I couldn't get it back because the locks had already been changed. The first few weeks after Blackwoods closed, I wasn't worried. Not really. Winnipeg has restaurants. I had experience. I updated my resume, printed copies at the library on Donald Street, and started making the rounds. Forks Market, Osborne Village, the Exchange District, the new places along Waterfront Drive. I filled out applications and shook hands with managers and told them I could start immediately. Some of them said they would call. Most of them didn't. What I hadn't anticipated was how many other cooks were looking for work at the same time. 2 other restaurants on Corridon had closed that spring, and suddenly the city had more experienced line cooks than it had positions to fill. Every kitchen I walked into already had a stack of resumes on the manager's desk. I started applying to places outside the restaurant industry, warehouse jobs in the North End, stocking shelves at the superstore on Regent, driving for a delivery app downtown. A few interviews happened, but the offers didn't follow. One warehouse manager told me they had received over 200 applications for 6 positions. He said it almost apologetically, like he knew the number itself was a kind of cruelty. By August, my savings were gone. I had never managed to put away much. Rent in Winnipeg isn't Toronto or Vancouver expensive, but $1,400 a month for a 1-bedroom still eats through a line cook's paycheck faster than most people realize, especially when that paycheck stops coming. I started skipping meals. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone would notice. I just quietly stopped buying things that weren't strictly necessary. Coffee became a luxury, so did fresh vegetables. I lived on rice, canned beans, and whatever was on clearance at the No Frills on Sargent Avenue. I lost 15 pounds in 2 months, and when I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized the person staring back. September came and I missed my first rent payment. I called the property management office and explained the situation. The woman on the phone was polite but firm. She told me they could give me until the end of the month. October arrived and I missed again. This time the call was shorter and the voice was less patient. By November, when I missed the 3rd payment, there were no more calls. just the letter. If you've ever been through something like this, you know the worst part isn't the fear. It's the shame. The shame of walking past your neighbors in the hallway and wondering if they know. The shame of checking your phone and seeing a call from a number you don't recognize and letting it ring, because it might be a collections agency. The shame of lying to your mother when she calls from Kenora and asks how you're doing, and you say fine, everything's great. Work is busy because the alternative is admitting that her son, the one she raised alone and put through culinary school at Red River College, is about to be homeless in the middle of a Manitoba winter. I want to be honest about something. There were nights during that period when I sat on the floor of my apartment with the lights off, staring at the glow of the street lamp outside my window, and I genuinely could not see a way forward. Not metaphorically. I mean, I could not construct in my mind a single realistic sequence of events that led from where I was sitting to a place where things were okay again. The math didn't work. The timeline didn't work. Nothing worked. By day 6 of the 10-day notice, I had started putting my things into garbage bags. I didn't own proper moving boxes, and it didn't matter anyway, because I had nowhere to move to. I had called the Salvation Army shelter on Henry Avenue and asked about availability, and the man on the phone said they were full, but I could try again closer to December. I called a friend from culinary school, Derek, and asked if I could crash on his couch. He said yes, but only for a week because his girlfriend was moving in 1 week. After that, I had no plan. That evening, around 5 o'clock, the sky already dark the way it gets dark in Winnipeg in November, suddenly and completely. As if someone just switched the lights off over the entire prairies, there was a knock on my door. It was quiet, almost polite. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered not answering. I was sitting on the kitchen floor surrounded by half-filled garbage bags, and I didn't want anyone to see what my life had become. But I opened the door anyway. Standing in the hallway was a woman I had seen only a handful of times in 4 years, Dorothy Fair. She owned the building, though the day-to-day management was handled by a property company downtown. Dorothy was in her early 60s, with short gray hair and the kind of weathered prairie face that suggested she had spent a significant portion of her life outdoors. She was wearing a heavy down parka and snow boots that were still wet from the walk outside, and she was holding a thermos in one hand and a manila folder in the other. I assumed she had come to tell me to leave sooner, or to deliver another piece of official paperwork. My stomach dropped the way it had been dropping for weeks, that familiar sinking sensation I had come to associate with every phone call, every envelope, every knock. But Dorothy didn't say anything about the eviction. Not right away. Instead, she looked past me into the apartment, took in the garbage bags and the bare walls and the dim overhead light, and she asked if she could come in. Her voice was calm, not cold, not overly warm, just steady, the way someone speaks when they've had a lot of practice staying even-tempered in difficult situations. I stepped aside and let her in. She set the thermos on the kitchen counter and unzipped her parka but didn't take it off. She looked around the room slowly, and I could see her reading the scene the same way I had been living it. The garbage bags, the empty fridge propped open because I had unplugged it to save on the hydro bill. The pile of rejection emails I had printed out and thrown on the table because, for some reason I still can't explain, I thought having them in physical form might motivate me to keep trying. She asked me what happened. I didn't want to tell her. There is something deeply uncomfortable about explaining your failures to someone who has the legal authority to remove you from your own home. But Dorothy stood there waiting, and she didn't seem to be in any rush, and something about the way she held that manila folder, loosely, like it wasn't the most important thing in the room, made me think that maybe she wasn't here to deliver bad news. So, I told her. I told her about Blackwood's closing, about the months of job hunting, about the savings that evaporated, and the meals I skipped and the calls to my mother that I filled with lies because the truth was too heavy to hand to someone who lived 4 hours away and couldn't do anything about it. I told her I had 6 days left and a couch to sleep on for 7, and after that I had absolutely nothing. When I finished, the apartment was so quiet I could hear the snow ticking against the window. Dorothy opened the manila folder. Inside it were several printed pages, but she didn't hand them to me. She set them on the counter beside the thermos and folded her hands in front of her. Then she told me something about herself that I had never known. Before she bought this building and the 2 others she owned in the West End, Dorothy had spent 25 years working as a social worker for the province of Manitoba. She had worked in child welfare, in housing support, in community outreach. She had spent decades walking into homes that looked a lot like mine did right now, talking to people who were standing on the edge of the same cliff I was standing on. She retired 3 years ago, and she told me that retirement made her restless in a way she hadn't expected. For the past year, she explained, she had been developing a plan. She wanted to open a community kitchen, not a soup kitchen. She was careful to make that distinction. A community kitchen, a place in the neighborhood where people could come to learn how to cook affordable, nutritious meals. A place where new immigrants and single parents and seniors living on fixed incomes could walk in, no questions asked, and learn skills that would stretch their grocery budgets and bring people together around a table. She had been researching from other cities. Toronto had some. Vancouver had some. There was a successful one in Hamilton she had visited twice. She had a small commercial space on Sherbrooke Street that she owned outright. She had some funding from a provincial community grant. She had the plan, the space, and the money to get started. What she didn't have was someone who knew how to run a kitchen. Then she looked at me, and I understood. She told me she would cancel the eviction. She would waive my back rent entirely. She would let me stay in the apartment rent-free for 4 months. In return, she wanted me to help her build the community kitchen from nothing, set up the space, design a menu of simple, affordable recipes, organize the first cooking classes, be the person who stood at the front of the room and showed people how to feed themselves and their families on $20 a week. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the gap between what I thought was about to happen and what was actually happening was so wide that my brain couldn't process it. 5 minutes ago, I was packing garbage bags. Now a woman I barely knew was offering me a second chance wrapped inside a project I had never imagined. I told her I wasn't qualified. I was a line cook, not a teacher. I had never run a program. I had never written a grant report or organized a community event or done any of the 100 things that a project like this would require. She nodded, like she had expected me to say exactly that. Then she said something that settled into my chest and hasn't since. She said, "You know what it's like to stare into an empty fridge and not know where your next meal is coming from. That's not something I can teach someone. That's something you already carry." I said yes. I don't even remember deciding. The word just came out, the way breath comes out involuntarily, because your body knows you need it before your mind catches up. The next morning I woke up at 6, which was the same time I had been waking up for weeks, but for the first time in months, the feeling that greeted me wasn't dread. It was something else. Something I was almost afraid to name because I thought if I acknowledged it too directly it might disappear. It was purpose. Dorothy picked me up in her truck, a battered gray Toyota Tacoma, with Manitoba plates so rusted you could barely read the numbers, and we drove to the space on Sherbrooke Street. It was a former bakery that had closed years ago. The front windows were covered in brown paper, and the inside smelled like dust and old flour, but the bones were good. There was a commercial kitchen in the back with stainless steel counters and a 6-burner gas range that still worked. There was a large open room in the front that could seat maybe 40 people, if we arranged the tables right. There was even a small office in the corner with a desk and a filing cabinet and a window that looked out onto the street. We spent the first 2 weeks cleaning, and I mean cleaning in the way that only someone who has worked in a professional kitchen understands. We scrubbed every surface. We degreased the hood vents. We descaled the dishwasher. We mopped the floors 3 times until the tiles went from gray to white. Dorothy worked alongside me the entire time, and I learned quickly that she was not the kind of person who supervised from a distance. She got on her hands and knees and scrubbed baseboards. She climbed a ladder to change fluorescent tubes in the ceiling. She drove to the Habitat Restore on King Street and came back with a truckload of donated tables and chairs that we sanded and repainted in the parking lot behind the building. While we worked, we talked. Dorothy told me about her years in social work, about the families she had helped and the ones she couldn't, about the systemic cracks that people fall through, the ones that look invisible from the outside, but feel like canyons when you're standing at the bottom. She told me about her late husband, Walter, who had been a carpenter and who had died of pancreatic cancer 4 years ago. She said that losing him was what made her realize she needed to do something meaningful with the time she had left. Not busy work, not hobbies, something that mattered. I told her about growing up in Kenora, about my mother, who worked 2 jobs at the paper mill and the grocery store and still somehow managed to cook dinner every night, about culinary school at Red River. where I learned technique but also learned that I loved the simplest act of feeding people, about Blackwoods, which for all its grease and chaos, had been the closest thing I had to a professional home. By the third week, we started reaching out to the neighborhood. Dorothy had connections I never could have imagined. She knew the director of the Immigrant Center on Notre Dame. She knew the coordinator at the Maui Wichi Atata Center. She knew pastors and teachers and community health workers and the woman who ran the food bank on Selkirk Avenue. She made phone calls and sent emails and knocked on doors, and slowly the word began to spread. A new community kitchen was opening on Sherbrooke Street. Free cooking classes, everyone welcome. We called it Common Table. The first class was on a Saturday morning in January. I had spent the entire previous night awake, not for anxiety this time, but from something closer to stage fright. I had planned a simple menu: lentil soup with root vegetables, a basic Bannock recipe that I had learned from an indigenous colleague at Blackwoods, and a simple vinaigrette for a winter salad using cabbage and carrots, ingredients you could buy for almost nothing at any grocery store in the city. I expected maybe 5 or 6 people. 17 showed up. They came in from the cold, stomping snow off their boots and unwinding scarves, and they filled the room with a noise I hadn't heard in months. Life. A young mother from the Philippines named Maria, who had moved to Winnipeg through the provincial nominee program and was struggling to feed her 2 kids on her settlement allowance. A retired man from the North End named Jerry, who had lived alone since his wife passed and had been eating frozen dinners every night for 2 years. A teenager named Aisha, whose family had arrived from Syria 3 years ago and who wanted to learn to cook because her mother was working double shifts at a hotel and someone needed to make dinner for her younger siblings. I stood at the front of the kitchen with a cutting board and a chef's knife, and I showed them how to dice an onion. It sounds small. It sounds almost absurdly simple. But I watched Maria's face when she realized she could cut an onion quickly and evenly without crying, and I watched Jerry carefully write down the lentil-to-water ratio in a little notebook he had brought from home, and I watched Asisha take a photo of the finished bannock with her phone to send to her mother, and something inside me that had been locked shut for a very long time quietly opened. The classes grew. By February, we were running 3 sessions a week: Tuesday evenings, Thursday evenings, and Saturday mornings. Dorothy handled the administrative side, the funding reports, the partnerships, the scheduling, while I ran the kitchen. We developed a curriculum of sorts, though it was loose and responsive. One week we focused on stretching a whole chicken into 3 meals. Another week we made jar salads that could be prepped on Sunday and eaten all week. We did a session on reading nutrition labels at the grocery store. We did another on how to store produce so it lasted longer, because in Winnipeg, where a head of lettuce costs $4 in January, waste is something no one can afford. People started bringing things. Maria brought a bag of rice from the Filipino grocery store on Sargent Avenue and taught the class how to make arroz caldo, a ginger chicken rice porridge her grandmother used to make. Jerry brought a cribbage board and started a game in the corner that became a regular fixture on Saturday mornings. Aisha started helping me prep before the Tuesday classes, and I realized she had a natural sense of timing and flavor that most culinary students take a year to develop. Common Table became more than a cooking class. It became a place where people showed up not just for the food, but for each other. I noticed it happening gradually, the way you notice a plant growing. You don't see the change day to day. But one morning, you look up and realize the room is full and the noise is louder and the laughter comes easier, and people are exchanging phone numbers and offering each other rides home after class. And the retired guy who came in alone on the first Saturday is now saving a seat for the teenager who helps him read the recipes because his glasses aren't strong enough. Then, in early March, something happened that I didn't see coming. A woman named Catherine Lawson walked into the Saturday morning class. She was in her 50s, well-dressed in a way that stood out slightly in our crowd, and she sat quietly in the back row and watched. I assumed she was someone from the neighborhood. After the class, she introduced herself. She was the executive director of a regional food services company called Prairie Harvest Catering, one of the largest contract catering operations in Manitoba. They provided meals for corporate offices, hospitals, schools, and government buildings across the province. She had heard about Common Table from a friend who volunteered at the Immigrant Center, and she had come to see it for herself. She asked me to walk her through the kitchen. I showed her the setup, the equipment, the ingredient lists we used for each class. The cost breakdowns I had started keeping in a spreadsheet to prove to Dorothy that we could feed 12 people a nutritious meal for under $35. Catherine looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. Then she looked at me and said that the ability to plan, cost, and execute menus at that level of efficiency was exactly what her company needed. She told me Prairie Harvest was expanding. They had just won a contract to supply meals for 3 new long-term care facilities in Winnipeg and Brandon, and they were looking for a kitchen supervisor who could manage high-volume meal production while keeping costs within the strict budgets that healthcare contracts require. She asked if I would be interested in coming in for an interview. I sat in my truck after she left, engine running, heat blasting against the -27 outside, and I stared at her business card. Catherine Lawson, Executive Director, Prairie Harvest Catering, a phone number, an email, an invitation to a future I hadn't thought possible 3 months ago. The interview was on a Wednesday. I wore the only dress shirt I still owned, a blue one that was slightly too big because of the weight I had lost. I took the bus to their facility on Dugald Road, a sprawling commercial kitchen 3 times the size of anything I had ever worked in. Catherine introduced me to her operations team and walked me through the facility. Industrial ovens the size of small cars, walk-in coolers you could park a truck in, a prep line that stretched the entire length of the building. She asked me about my experience. I told her about Blackwood's 5 years on the hotline, and she nodded. Then she asked me about Common Table. I told her about the lentil soup and the bannock and the 17 people who showed up on a Saturday morning expecting nothing and leaving with a new skill. I told her about Maria and Jerry and Aisha. I told her about the spreadsheet, about how I had learned to calculate cost per serving down to the cent, because every dollar mattered when you were feeding people on a shoestring. I told her about the time we had to improvise an entire class when our produce delivery didn't show up, and I built a meal for 15 people out of canned tomatoes, dried pasta, and whatever spices we had in the cupboard. Catherine smiled at that. She said that the ability to improvise under pressure was worth more than any formal credential, and that everything I had described, the menu planning, the cost management, the team coordination, the ability to stay calm when things go sideways, was exactly the job's description she was trying to fill. 2 days later, I got the call. I was sitting in the Common Table kitchen, prepping vegetables for the Thursday evening class, when my phone buzzed. It was Catherine. She offered me the position, kitchen supervisor, full-time hours, benefits. A salary that was more than I had ever made at Blackwood's. I said yes, and then I set the phone down on the stainless steel counter and stood there for a very long time, looking at my hands, which were still holding a peeler and half a carrot, and I tried to understand how the same hands that had been stuffing clothes into garbage bags 10 weeks ago were now holding an offer letter and a future. I cried. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I stood alone in that kitchen, with the overhead lights humming and the faint smell of cumin and onions in the air, and I cried the way you cry when you've been holding your breath for so long that the first real inhale feels like it might break you open. I called my mother that night. For the first time in months, I told her the truth, all of it. The job loss, the eviction notice, the garbage bags, Dorothy's offer, Common Table, everything. The line was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, in that steady, practical way of hers, "Well, it sounds like you found your way." And I could hear that she was crying too, and trying not to let me know the way mothers do. I started at Prairie Harvest the following Monday. The work was demanding. Feeding 300 people a day across multiple facilities requires a level of organization and stamina that makes a restaurant line look relaxed by comparison. But I loved it. I loved the precision. I loved the scale. I loved the challenge of making institutional food taste like something someone's mother might have cooked. I experimented with spice blends and tested recipes on my team and pushed for menus that were nutritious without being boring, because the people eating these meals were seniors in care homes who deserved better than boiled chicken and canned peas. But I didn't leave Common Table. I couldn't. Even after I started working full-time, I kept volunteering every Saturday morning. Dorothy had hired 2 part-time staff by then, a community outreach coordinator and a kitchen assistant, but I still came in to teach. It had become the most important thing in my week, not because I felt obligated, but because every time I stood at the front of that kitchen and showed someone how to make something nourishing out of almost nothing, I was reminded of the version of myself who had been sitting on a kitchen floor in the dark, unable to imagine tomorrow, There was a moment about 6 months after I started at Prairie Harvest that I think about often. It was a Saturday in September. The leaves were just starting to turn along the Assiniboine River, and the air had that crisp Manitoba autumn quality that makes you want to be outside and cook something warm at the same time. I arrived at Common Table early to set up, and I found Aisha already there. She had let herself in with the spare key Dorothy had given her and was prepping ingredients for the day's class. She had laid everything out on the counter exactly the way I always did. Onions, carrots, celery, garlic, all washed and ready. The cutting boards were clean. The knives were sharpened. The pots were on the stove. She looked up when I walked in and said, very matter-of-factly, that she had applied to the culinary arts program at Red River College for the winter semester. She wanted to know if I would write her a reference letter. I leaned against the doorframe and looked at this 17-year-old kid who had walked into the very first class 9 months ago because her mother was working too hard to cook dinner and who was now standing in a kitchen at 7 in the morning on a Saturday because she had found something she was good at and wanted to build a life around it. And I thought about how none of this, not the kitchen, not the classes, not this moment, would exist if a 62-year-old woman hadn't knocked on my door on a dark November evening and seen something in me that I couldn't see in myself. I told Aisha I would write the letter. Then I asked her to show me how her mother made that Syrian red pepper dip, the one she had brought in the week before, because I wanted to add it to the next class menu. She smiled and started pulling out ingredients, and the kitchen filled with the sound of someone chopping and the smell of roasting peppers, and for a moment the entire world was exactly the size of that room. Common Table is still running. It's been 2 years now. Dorothy stepped back from daily operations last spring, though she still comes in on Saturdays to drink coffee and play cribbage with Jerry, who hasn't missed a session since the first one. Maria completed a bookkeeping course through a program we connected her with, and now works part-time managing our budget. Aisha got into Red River and is halfway through her first year. She wants to specialize in pastry, which makes sense because she has the kind of patience and precision that pastry demands and that I have never had. As for me, I was promoted to head of menu development at Prairie Harvest 8 months ago. I oversee meal planning for 11 facilities across Manitoba and northwestern Ontario. Last month, I proposed a pilot program to incorporate community kitchen principles into our care home meal services, letting residents participate in simplified cooking activities as a form of social engagement and therapy. Catherine approved it immediately. But the part of this story that still sits with me, the part I keep turning over in my mind late at night, when the house is quiet and I can hear the radiator clicking the way it always does, when the temperature drops, is how close I came to disappearing. Not dying, disappearing. Slipping through one of those systemic cracks Dorothy used to talk about, the ones that look invisible from the outside but feel like canyons from the bottom. I was 10 days away from losing my apartment, and I had already lost almost everything else. My job, my savings, my confidence, my ability to see a future. I was one knock on the door away from a completely different outcome. Dorothy didn't give me money. She didn't give me charity. She gave me something much harder to quantify and much more valuable. She gave me a role, a reason to get up in the morning, a way to use the one skill I actually had, cooking, not to save myself, but to help other people, and in doing so, to accidentally save myself anyway. That's the part that still gets me. I wasn't rescued, I was redirected, and the difference matters more than I can say. Before I finish, I want to ask you something. Wherever you are right now, whatever you're going through, I want you to take a moment and think about a time when someone did something for you that they didn't have to do. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be life-changing. Maybe someone held a door. Maybe someone believed you when no one else did. Maybe someone just showed up. Whatever it is, drop it in the comments below. Because if there's one thing Common Table taught me, it's that kindness doesn't need to be grand to matter. It just needs to be real. If this story meant something to you, please take a second to hit that like button. Share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And subscribe to Honor Stories for more stories like this one. Because sometimes, the moment when everything seems like it's ending is actually the quiet beginning of something you never could have planned. And sometimes, the person who changes your life is someone you barely know, standing in your hallway with a thermos and a folder, seeing the thing you've forgotten how to see in yourself.